They didn't just conquer the villages, they enslaved the people and forced them into the Mongol court's cruelest pleasures. Behind thick walls unseen by the world, unspeakable horrors were carried out in silence. Mothers vanished, children screamed, and lovers were torn apart while the rulers watched with cold amusement. Even death was not a mercy here. The punishments went far beyond anything the imagination could endure. Whispers tell of rituals so dark, so twisted, that those who witnessed them were never the same again. In the shadow of Genghis Khan's empire, cruelty was perfected, and no one, not even the strongest warriors, could escape its grasp. The wind swept across the endless steppes, carrying with it the scent of dust, blood, and the faint whispers of those who had vanished long before their names could be remembered. Villages lay scattered like broken teeth across the land, each one marked by the scars of conquest and fear. The nomadic empire expanded with relentless precision, its shadow creeping over the horizon, unstoppable and implacable. From the outside it seemed like unstoppable power, glory, and conquest, but inside the walls of the Khan's court, a darkness festered that no storyteller dared to describe, and no poet dared to rhyme. The Mongol court was a labyrinth of tents, timbered halls, and hidden chambers, each more elaborate and secretive than the last. At first glance it glittered with the wealth of plundered villages, silks from China, spices from the West, treasures looted from cities that had thought themselves untouchable. But beneath the glittering surfaces, behind doors that groaned with the weight of secrecy, suffering lived as a constant, tangible presence. It was not only the conquered who were trapped in this web of fear. It was anyone who entered the orbit of the Khan's dominion. For once a person was chosen, there was no escape. Among the first captives brought to the court were villagers, farmers, and artisans, their lives uprooted in a single night. They arrived trembling, their eyes wide with terror, clinging to memories of home that would soon vanish. Families were torn apart, men separated from women, children from parents, all shuffled into roles they could never have imagined. The strongest were taken as warriors, the cleverest as scribes or servants, but it was the vulnerable, those with no claim to skill or influence, who endured the greatest horrors. These individuals were dragged into hidden chambers where the court's darkest experiments unfolded, unseen and unspoken beyond the fortress of the Khan's tents. The court itself was alive with discipline and ritual, every action a reflection of authority and control. Warriors moved in silence, their footsteps calculated, their eyes unblinking. Servants scurried through the labyrinthine corridors, carrying messages, food, and sometimes the terrified bodies of those chosen for the Khan's attention. The air seemed heavy with anticipation, as if every breath was measured, every heartbeat known, and every thought suspect. Outsiders who wandered too close, or insiders who dared a glance too long, vanished into the shadows. What happened to them was never recorded. What could be described was horrifying enough to haunt the imagination of the living. The Khan himself remained a figure of terrifying charisma, his presence alone capable of bending the will of the strongest men and women. His gaze was not just observant, it was invasive, cutting through facades and exposing hidden fears. Those who dared to meet his eyes found themselves shivering, a cold understanding settling in their bones that nothing could protect them from what might come next. Yet this was not mere cruelty for its own sake. Every act of suffering served a purpose in the machinery of control, a brutal assertion that in the Mongol court, power was absolute and mercy was a myth. Among the many who endured, some tried to adapt, to survive in a world where rules shifted with a glance. They learned to read the signs. A subtle nod, a sharp tone, a fleeting expression on a guard's face could mean life or unthinkable torment. But adaptation was never enough. The court thrived on unpredictability, on fear, on the knowledge that at any moment the fragile illusion of safety could shatter, leaving one exposed to horrors beyond comprehension. It was this constant tension, this relentless pressure, that became as oppressive as the cold steel of the swords that hung on the walls. The victims themselves became instruments in the Khan's display of power. Beauty, youth, strength, intelligence, all could be exploited, molded into shapes that served the court's darkest appetites. There were whispers of rituals designed to test loyalty and obedience, trials that left marks on the body and soul. Those who survived carried these marks forever, their identities reshaped by the cruelty they had endured. Even the language of their suffering was stripped away. There were no words to describe the acts perpetrated behind the hidden doors of the court. The Mongol court did not tolerate weakness, not in soldiers, not in servants, and not in those brought from conquered lands. Every individual was measured, observed, and tested. Punishments were swift and imaginative, designed to instill fear while maintaining the appearance of ritualized justice. Blood became currency, screams became signals, and silence became a tool for control. Even the guards who enforced these rules were not immune, for witnessing atrocities exacted a toll, and some were consumed by guilt, madness, or despair. Yet none could rebel, none could escape, none could question the hierarchy that rendered human lives expendable. And in the midst of all this, the Mongol court continued its outward displays of power and prosperity. Guests from allied tribes and conquered nations would arrive to witness the might of the empire. Its warriors disciplined, its treasures vast, its culture thriving. But the darkness within remained hidden, a secret sustained by fear, secrecy, and the unspoken complicity of all who wished to survive. To those outside, it was an empire of conquest and glory. To those inside, it was a place where every shadow could kill, every glance could wound, and every day could end in unimaginable horror. This was the world into which the victims were thrown, a world where the human spirit was tested, broken, and sometimes erased entirely. And yet even here, small sparks of resistance, hope, and courage flickered. Some remembered their past lives with longing. Some plotted small acts of defiance. Some simply clung to the fragile belief that survival itself could be a form of victory. These moments were fleeting, often extinguished by the relentless cruelty of the court, yet they remained a testament to the resilience of those forced to endure the unendurable. The stage was set. The characters were trapped in a theater of terror, every action scrutinized, every choice fraught with danger. The world outside knew only of conquests and victories, but the true stories of the Mongol court, the hidden horrors, the suffering, the manipulation, and the cruelty, remained buried behind walls, behind tents, behind doors that no one dared open. And it was within these walls, in the shadows of absolute power, that the most horrific practices of Genghis Khan's court would unfold, shaping the lives of those caught in its grasp forever. The days in the Mongol court blurred into one another, each one heavier than the last, each one steeped in the quiet anticipation of horrors yet to come. The captives, once villagers with names and memories, were now shadows moving through a labyrinth of tents and timbered halls. Their faces, pale and haunted, told the story of a humanity stripped bare. Every footstep they took echoed on the polished floors, a constant reminder that someone was always watching, always waiting. No one knew which corner held safety and which held the instruments of torment, yet every heartbeat carried the unshakable knowledge that at any moment, life could be extinguished or twisted into something unrecognizable. The Khan's warriors patrolled the corridors with an eerie precision. Their eyes, like steel, missed nothing. Even the faintest tremor in a hand, the slightest quiver of fear could draw their attention. The captives learned quickly that to survive, one had to move as if one were invisible, to breathe as if the act itself could betray them. And yet the court demanded presence and submission simultaneously. Those who failed to maintain this impossible balance were pulled into shadowed chambers, where screams became their only language and survival, their only prayer. Among the captives, patterns began to emerge, horrifying in their predictability. Certain individuals were singled out repeatedly, their bodies and spirits tested in rituals that were both cruel and meticulous. The rituals were designed not only to enforce obedience, but to assert the absolute power of the Khan. Even the strongest men and women could not predict the nature of these trials, and each one left its indelible mark. Some emerged broken, some shattered in silence, and some vanished entirely, swallowed by the darkness of the court. The whispers of these acts spread like a poison through the captive population. Fear intertwined with curiosity. No one knew exactly what awaited, yet all could feel it approaching. The more one tried to prepare, the more impossible the preparation became. Even those who believed themselves immune to terror discovered that the court operated on a different logic, one that placed power above humanity and spectacle above mercy. Every passing day, the invisible chains tightened, drawing the captives further into the abyss. It was not just fear that held sway. The Mongol court operated on control, manipulation, and the exploitation of desires and weaknesses. Captives were made to observe, to witness the punishment of others, and to internalize the lesson that survival depended on compliance. Trust became a dangerous luxury. Bonds formed between captives could be shattered in an instant, as the Khan's agents would exploit every connection for cruelty. Even the innocent gestures of solidarity were sometimes twisted into instruments of suffering, reminding all that in this world, loyalty could be weaponized. The court itself became a stage for unthinkable practices, a theater of terror, where the line between punishment and perverse spectacle blurred. Warriors and servants alike participated in acts that defied morality, acts so shocking that even the hardened captives sometimes questioned the limits of human cruelty. Certain rituals targeted not only the body but the mind, forcing individuals to confront their deepest fears, their most private vulnerabilities, and their suppressed griefs. The Khan observed it all with a detached fascination, as if the suffering of others were merely a form of entertainment, a demonstration of supremacy that required no empathy. Even the nights offered no respite. Sleep, if it came at all, was haunted by the shadows of past horrors and the anticipation of new ones. The faint rustle of a curtain, the soft footfall of a guard, or the creak of a door could ignite panic. Dreams merged with reality, creating a disorienting world where captives were never certain whether they were awake or trapped in another layer of torment. This psychological pressure was deliberate. It ensured that every moment of consciousness carried the weight of fear and obedience, further reinforcing the absolute power of the court. Among the captives, subtle acts of defiance began to surface, though each was measured by desperation rather than courage. Some whispered prayers, some memorized the patterns of guards, some clung to fragments of past lives as reminders of identity. But each act, however small, carried enormous risk. Discovery meant punishment beyond imagination, and yet the faint glimmer of resistance persisted. These small rebellions, fleeting though they were, became sparks of human resilience amid overwhelming darkness. The racial hierarchy embedded in the court amplified the suffering. Conquered peoples brought from distant lands were treated as expendable, their cultures and identities dismissed or violently suppressed. Those who bore different skin, spoke different tongues, or practiced different customs were often singled out for the harshest treatments, their otherness weaponized against them. This systemic cruelty reinforced the Khan's dominance, instilling terror not only through physical suffering, but through the dehumanization of entire communities. Every act of punishment carried a lesson. Survival depended not on justice but on submission, and mercy was reserved for those deemed worthy by the whims of power. Amid this orchestrated chaos, the captives became intimately acquainted with fear, shame, and despair. Each day layered upon the last, a cumulative weight that eroded hope. Yet in some, even in the bleakest corners of the court, tiny flames of awareness and defiance smoldered. They began to notice the cracks in the armor of the oppressors, the slight hesitations, the small inconsistencies that hinted at vulnerability. Though survival remained paramount, these glimpses of imperfection were dangerous but intoxicating, offering faint proof that the terror surrounding them was not infallible. The rising action of this dark narrative culminated in a growing sense of inevitability. Something larger, something unbearable was approaching. The captives could feel it in the tension that hung in the air, in the watchful eyes of the guards, in the subtle shifts in the Khan's demeanor. Whispers of coming rituals, punishments, and trials grew more vivid, more specific, and more terrifying. The court was preparing for events that would test the limits of endurance, obedience, and human resilience, rituals that would mark the boundary between survival and annihilation. And so the stage was set for horror at its apex. The captives, already stripped of certainty and hope, faced not only the physical dangers of the court, but the psychological terror of knowing that the worst was yet to come. Each individual was trapped in a spiral of fear and anticipation, a relentless countdown towards suffering that would test the body, the mind, and the spirit. The Mongol court, in all its calculated cruelty, had achieved the impossible. It had transformed human beings into instruments of terror, awaiting the next act in a drama of dominance that would leave scars far deeper than any wound could convey. The rising tension was palpable. Every heartbeat, every glance, every whispered footstep carried the weight of impending doom. And in this charged atmosphere, the captives could do nothing but wait, survive, and bear witness to the unfolding nightmare, a nightmare crafted meticulously by the unyielding hand of Genghis Khan and his architects of cruelty. The doors slammed shut, and silence swallowed the hall, broken only by muffled cries. The captives, trembling, knew there was no escape, no mercy, no witness, no hope. The Khan's eyes pierced each soul, measuring fear, obedience, and despair. Rituals of cruelty unfolded with terrifying precision, each act designed to break bodies and spirits alike. Screams echoed against stone and timber, a haunting chorus of suffering. In that moment, time itself seemed to freeze, every heartbeat a drum of impending doom. The court's darkness reached its apex, and those who survived would never again be whole. The screams faded, leaving silence heavier than any roar. The survivors walked among shadows, carrying wounds the eye could not see. The Mongol court remained unchanged, indifferent to suffering, yet something had shifted in those who endured, an unspoken understanding of resilience, of survival against unimaginable cruelty. Names were forgotten, bodies scarred, but the memory of injustice lingered, etched into their very being. And as the empire marched onward, the question remained, how much of humanity could endure before the weight of cruelty consumed it entirely? The shadows of the past whispered, warning that history's horrors never truly vanish,